feature presentation.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I just kind of wanted to start off with the film has played the festival circuit. It's gotten its theatrical release. We're at the point now where, people are watching it and, taking away their own sort of expectations with the film, but also analyzing it. So I wanted to ask you how this has all felt for you in terms of it being your feature-length directorial debut.
Yeah, it's been really amazing. I feel like it's so exciting to just have it out in the world and to have, when I have the pleasure of being at a Q&A in person, having those conversations afterwards, it's really one of the most meaningful parts about making the film is sharing it with audiences and just hearing their reflections and having conversations around it. It's been really special.
Do you see the film in a different way when you have conversations with audience members and film critics and interviewers compared to when you're making the movie? Because it is, filmmaking is a very insular thing and very
Yeah.
personal in certain aspects. And then when you release it into the world, it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I've noticed in a lot of the interviews, a lot of people will be talking about how, the first thing they'll mention is, oh, is this semi-autobiographical
Yeah,
or
yeah.
auto fiction in that way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because it has come up a lot, and it's that part has been a little bit hard because I think that because maybe I'm mixed race Japanese Canadian, and some of the characters are that people make maybe more assumptions around how autobiographical the story is, and that is challenging because my family, the truth is that it's a very different family as what is in the film, so this film is definitely fictional, the characters are fictional, the events are fictional. um and so, yeah, it's been a little bit weird, I guess, having that kind of assumption made quite often, and trying to just, of course, there are some personal themes. I think most people who write, uh, films that are meaningful to them, there's always going to be some personal themes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. For example, in the film, the parents are going through quite a, toxic and destructive time. And although my parents got divorced, I never once saw them argue. They had like the most responsible divorce that one could imagine. And, my father is a polar opposite character to Steve's character. So, I understand it's easy for people to jump to that, but that has been a little bit of a strange thing to deal with as the filmmaker.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
again, people are always looking for those narratives to attach when you're having those conversations, but it's also, I think, good just to ask the filmmaker and sort of
Yeah.
create that sort of conversation in itself. You
Totally.
just mentioned divorce. This is something that I think is so important to not only the narrative, but the sensitivity that you bring towards the subject matter. There's a line in the film, I believe from one of the counselors, where she mentions that marriage is a fragile ecosystem.
Mhm.
And I think the family dynamic in this movie and how divorce or sort of the looming sort of air of it is coming through and affecting each individual member. You mentioned themes. I was curious,
Mhm.
when you're starting from the writing point of view, is there a theme or themes for each individual character that you're focusing on in terms of their development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And 100%, yes, I knew that I wanted to tie together their themes by this overarching theme of uncertainty, and this idea that they're all confronting these unstable foundations within themselves. So I knew that that was like the thread that ties together these three predominant narratives. But for me, when I was looking at Emmy's story, the youngest, I was thinking about how she's going through this existential crisis, how she's encountering death for the first time, but doesn't quite know how to make sense of it. And then the, the eldest sibling, Stephanie, she is really trying to seek a sense of belonging. And that's a big part of what her journey is, both with friends and also within her family unit. And then Judith, I knew that she's having questions around her identity. And I think there's a part of her where she feels this need to self-actualize, to, maybe become the person that she isn't yet in so many different ways, but sort of feeling blocked into these uh, different identities that she's already carved out in her life, and just really questioning those. So yeah, for each character, I definitely was kind of looking at it from these different perspectives for sure.
Did you have the story mapped out, or was it something that you were finding or discovering as you were developing the characters themselves? Because there's an
Mhm.
aspect, especially, mentioning, Emmy, with not only the anxiety, but the
Mhm.
anxiety that you cause for us as the viewer in terms of how worried we are for her, especially in the third act.
Yeah, I definitely think that the general arc of the story came early on in the writing process. Of course, it's always shifting and it's always kind of falling into place. And I think different things fall into place earlier than other things. But I would say, like, the overall plot, um, fairly early on in the process was figured out. And then a lot of the issues that I was confronting with writing after that were just, things that weren't quite developed enough, or, maybe certain characters. Like, I know for a while, Steve's character I was really working on. So yeah, definitely certain things fell into place at different times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's something really interesting with Steve as well that I thought a lot about after the second time I watched it, was where you have Steve fixing, a closet and, going to the store and picking up the item that he needs to repair it. And it almost seems like Steve is one of those people that's very practical or pragmatic, and that the situation has to be tangible in order for him to fix things.
Yeah.
But he doesn't listen, and the
Yeah.
emotion of his own, insecurities and vulnerability, explaining that character's sort of arc. But there's just something about that that works on sort of both a literal and sort of metaphorical aspect of that character, and I think like that, just those subtle little nuances there are really important. So I was
Yeah.
also curious about, in the screenwriting phase, are you thinking about the locations themselves and where you want to film, and maybe incorporating certain elements? Because obviously that cave is such an
It's
important and integral. I mean, I don't like saying, a location is necessarily a character, because it can sound a little cliched, but it's so integral to the storyline.
totally. Yeah, I wish that as I was writing it, I had these perfect locations that existed in real life that I had known about as I was writing them, because that was a huge source of anxiety for me. Because I think I felt the same way as I was writing it, where I was like, oh, these locations must be great. But do they exist? So no, I didn't have locations that I knew about specifically, that I knew would be available at least, and I had no idea about the cave in particular. So that was definitely stressful, because I definitely had this very clear vision in my head of what I wanted it to represent and be, and it's so hugely important to the film symbolically, um, that I think about a year before shooting, I definitely started to panic, and I was like, okay, I need to find these now. So it was the summer before we shot, and myself and the cinematographer Norm Lee, we went searching for the cave. And I think that was something that I had to do just for my own level of, like, okay, we have the cave, I can see it. So once we found the cave, then I was able to, nothing really changed in the script as a result of finding the cave, but it was more like, okay, nothing needs to change in the script. Like, I can keep it as is, and we have a cave to shoot in.
Was the cave sequence, and I don't want to give too much away in the third
Yeah.
act, but was that at all replicated in a studio? Or because some of it feels like it's very much, you know it- it's there's a dangerous element to it all, but
Yeah.
obviously, like, you are taking those precautions and everything, but it just feels like there's nothing sort of, there's no facade to it. It feels very real and in the moment.
Right. That's awesome to hear, because so the cave that you see in the film is actually, in a way, three different things. It's two real caves and one build in a pool at the retreat that we were shooting at. That's a bit of a spoiler. Oops. Um, anyways, but yes, there's so many different needs for this cave, which goes beyond the third act, just in terms of what we wanted to show visually, and how we wanted to interact with the cave throughout the film. So yeah, it definitely was, a couple different caves, and two of the two caves that were real caves in real life, those were actually right next to each other in a bay called Rosie Bay in Tofino.
Those would also probably be called convenient caves because of having them both together.
Sort of, except for like we never shot them at the same time because they were used for such different purposes.
Yeah.
One of them was, anytime that kids are playing around the cave, that was actually, both of the caves, actually have to walk 15 minutes from the parking lot, go around a bend, and then you literally only have 3 hours to shoot in at either of the caves before a tide comes in and you'll get stuck. So we always had to be very quick there. It was, of course, safe because we knew exactly when the tide was coming in, but it was a lot of like pressure in terms of just getting the shots and getting all the kids in, getting all the gear in. And then the other cave was really only used for some specialty shots where, we had to see it more from a distance. So yeah, we never really did them both at the same time. Maybe only once.
Well, it feels
Yeah.
seamless in terms of
Right.
its design and its execution. And I mean, your direction is, I mean, the critic term always is it's so assured, but it really feels like you've been doing this for decades. This is a kind of
Oh,
movie that I think any filmmaker would be honored to have in their career. So I wanted to ask you about making that transition from short features or shorts to feature films.
yeah.
And was there a major difference in terms of the structuring of the story? Because obviously length comes into mind, but in terms of just your own creative process.
Oh, there were so many challenges and learning curves, like everything. It was really fulfilling though and so exciting. And I feel like, as I was doing it, I was so challenged the entire time, just on every level, but also so fulfilled, which was really great feeling. I think that's how it should feel ideally when you get to that phase. Um, so yeah, because I think anyone going from shorts to features, it's always going to be this it's just such a bigger undertaking. Um, but yeah, the things that stick out for me are probably just the endurance of writing over a period of numerous years. And then of course the shoot itself. It's like I remember after the first week just being like, oh my God, can I do three more of that? Like that's so intense. Like, but then you just keep going and sure enough, you kind of get into your flow and it's all good. But I think that was one of the biggest things that struck me doing this first feature.
Do you feel like a level of adrenaline that comes in when you kind of get the scene that you're looking for, or something that really translates from the page that you've written to the actual image on the frame or in the screen?
Oh yeah, I mean adrenaline and just pure joy. It's really addictive. I mean, especially once we cast the actors and once we were shooting it, and when a scene works out, it's just the best feeling in the world. And I think, yeah, when I said casting the actors, I think what I mean by that is that once I start working with the actors, I really am like, oh my gosh, this is this is the scene. It's happening. Like even in the rehearsal process, it's often this just really great feeling where everything is just suddenly clicking together that had just been in my head for so long.
And seeing it come to fruition, I'm sure is something that's almost hard to describe, because it's just something that you create on the page, and you're seeing other people sort of involved wanting to bring your story to fruition. So I was in terms of the casting, I'm curious about this, because you could have a great actor in an individual role, but how important was it for you to sort of have the four leads together? In terms of, did you have a rehearsal process? Because it seems like that is such an important aspect of the storytelling, is the chemistry between the four, and not just one individual character or one casting choice in the film.
Totally. I mean, they're supposed to be a full family. And yeah, in my head, I had this vision of like 2 weeks, we're all going to be together. I'll at least have 2 weeks with the girls to work and like really understand, how they work since they're children and they're carrying so much of the film. As it worked out, we didn't find the kids, we didn't cast them at least until a week and a half before shooting.
Oh, wow.
Stephanie, I know it was horrible. I wanted to cast them months ahead and we couldn't find, the person who was going to play Stephanie. And I'd seen Remy Martell's tapes, and I had worked with her in the auditions, and I knew she was incredible, but I wanted to cast the two sisters with both of them in mind, of course, just to look at ages and everything. And I still hadn't found quite the right Stephanie. And then Naya Breitkreitz, who played Stephanie, her tape came in. It was the very last one. I was in full panic mode, and I just felt this huge sense of relief, because it was like, as soon as I saw her tape, I just knew. I was like, okay, this is the person who I was waiting for. And then, so once we got everything, solidified, moving really quickly, and got them over to Gabriel Island where we were shooting the film, or a lot of the film, within, I think, 5 minutes of them being in a room together, they were already like sisters. So that just clicked very naturally. But then on top of that, and I think this is okay to say, because Ali said it many times in Q&As and stuff, but Ali Maki, she got COVID um, right as we were about to do rehearsals, which is a shame. And I felt so bad for her too, because it must have been such a weird state of mind to come, like literally when she jumped into the film, she was jumping right into set. And we'd worked together a little bit during the casting process and talked a bit, but that's the extent of what we were able to work on together. And she didn't get to work with the rest of the family. But it's really funny, because I think I worked with Luke Roberts, who played Steve, the most, and he's probably the person who I needed to work with the least, because of course I want to focus mostly on the kids, and Ali, because she's, such the center point to so much of the film. So, as much as I really wanted this luxurious rehearsal process, that is what happened. But in a way, Ali said it was kind of interesting, because in so many ways her character feels so isolated from the family. And I think it worked out just fine. And she's such a pro that it was no problem.
No, absolutely. And
Yeah.
Ali Maki, like that performance, as you mentioned, the isolation and the disconnect and all these emotions of, hanging on to her marriage, but also, the loss of her mother. And, I keep thinking about that amazing sort of performance of I Give to You. And, you mentioning having very little rehearsal time. Did you talk at all about that moment? Because it is such an amazing sort of insular, sort of lost moment when you kind of focus on what she is not only singing, but saying in that scene.
Yeah, totally. So, like, once we started shooting, we didn't go into that scene until, maybe 2 weeks in. So we were working on other things, and it was so intensely busy that I just didn't even have time to talk to her about that. Like, it was just so like, okay, now we're doing this and this. Um, but I think maybe once we got through the first week and it was coming up the next week, then we finally got to talk about it. And I think, yeah, we definitely talked about that moment, and just the overall sort of internal message around it, and what's happening for her. And Ali got it right away. I think that I didn't even know that she was such a good singer.
Oh, she's
And
amazing.
I know, and this wasn't even her like best. I mean, I'm sure she's singing incredibly, but I told her, I was like, you don't need to even go all out. Like, it's a much more sort of somber internal feeling. Um, so yeah, we talked even about that, and like, it's amazing what a talented singer she is.
Well, the vulnerability of that
Yeah.
performance, and what you were just saying there, where it's not about showcasing the vocal range or the
Mhm.
beauty in the voice, and it's all there,
Yeah.
but it's about the feeling and what it elicits in that moment, and just that incredible, just the way that you focus in on her, but like the close up and the tears, it's just,
Mhm.
you really do feel that moment, and you feel almost like that is sort of the breaking point, really, in terms of how things are playing out. But
Mhm.
going back to the script stage, I was also curious, because you allow for scenes to breathe, and it's not always about the most sound or score. It's about sort of what's, the quietness and in the
Yeah.
moment, in the environment. Was that something as well that you were conscientious of when you were writing the script, that you wanted to allow the environment to have as much of a speaking role within the context of the story?
Yeah, definitely. I think I had a clear idea of, mm, I guess, the the pace, and I don't mean necessarily the pace in the edit, although of course that as well is something I was thinking about, but even just sort of the pace of moments. And of course, that was also something that I was finding alongside the actors, and sometimes it would change on set. But a lot of times I just wanted to give the actors permission to, just like take as long as you want. Like, don't don't worry about the fact that we're shooting on film or anything. Like, no need to rush any moments. Like, we can always do a version that's a bit quicker if we need to. But I wanted them to just really feel like they were, in real life, when we're with people we're comfortable with. It's not always about filling the space. And I really wanted those emotional beats, those quiet emotional beats, to be, really prominent in the final film for sure.
Absolutely. You just mentioned that you shot on film. Was that specifically to sort of coincide with the period? Because there is something when you watch, digital works, and it's obviously gotten much better, in the early days of, like, say, Danny Boyle shooting 28 Days Later, or Michael Mann shooting, digitally in terms of, like, Public Enemies. But you can always kind of tell with period if it's
Yeah.
digital. There's kind of an artifice there. The texture and the grain of this movie feels like it does transport you back to a certain period. Was
Mhm.
that always the case that you wanted in terms of shooting on film? Because I know that that's also become harder to do, obviously, with the way things are, and especially a smaller production.
Totally. Well, yes, absolutely. I think the fact that it's said in 1994, it absolutely lends itself to being shot on film. I love shooting on film, and the DP Norm Lee, who I've worked with on, most of my prior shorts, he loves shooting on film, and all of our past work together has been on film. And so, it is also just a huge preference. Like, it just really speaks to me. I think it has such a beautiful quality to it. And of course, I do think beautiful things can be shot digitally, and I think shitty things can be shot on film too. So it's not to say, like, there's necessarily, like, that I think everything I do has to be shot on film, but probably a lot of the things that I work on that are at least, things I feel really passionately about, that would probably be my first choice as well. Um, but again, that's not to say, I think, like, there's so many different pros and cons of course, there's so many pros to shooting digitally as well. Like, of course, cost wise, it can be cheaper. But because I've worked on film so much, as well as Norm, we really know how to be really diligent about what we're shooting, and really thoughtful around the coverage. Like, we don't shoot a bunch of coverage. We shoot the shot that we want to shoot. Yeah, we don't, I mean, most of what we shot is in the film. Like, we don't have all these extra angles that we could have used.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah, we don't really do that. And I think that is part of what makes it possible to shoot on film, is to just be really, and that's part of what I love about shooting on film too, is that you really can't waste, you really can't be wasteful. And so it really, forces me as a director to be really just thoughtful and conscious about the shots alongside the DP. So, and I love that aspect of it. It feels exciting for me.
Do you think that relationship that you've already built up with Norman had helped with that? Because again, you just mentioned, you have to be strategic with
Yeah.
using film, but because you have such a shorthand with a filmmaker, or, a cinematographer that you've worked with before, that maybe alleviates some of the stress when you're going into a production that is both, maybe time consuming in terms of, like, even as you're mentioning, the cave sequences and things like that, but having somebody that you've worked with maybe helps that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we work the same way. When it's, we know that we're not going to shoot things that probably won't be in the film. And sometimes, even if we set something up and spent time doing that, if it didn't feel right, we were just like, no, let's not shoot a take of this, because it's not working. It doesn't look good. Like, like, we need to figure out what's not working before we shoot this, because why would we waste that film? And really, when we're working like this, when we know very clearly what our shots are, it does also save a lot of time on set, because we're not setting up a bunch of things that we don't really want to use, or that's, we just feel so about. We're setting up the shot, we're getting it a few times, and then we move on and we're, you know, so in a way there's an efficiency to it as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, again, I don't want to ruin anything or spoil anything for
Yeah.
people that are going to
I feel
watch
like I'm
this.
already.
Oh no, I know. I'm always very sensitive with these things because
No,
spoilers are
thank you.
always the, you know, the one thing where people will be like, "Oh, I didn't want to know that going in."
Yeah.
I think people should watch this conversation or listen to it afterwards.
Yeah.
But but the thing that I was really curious about, because you mentioned, you know, the strategic nature of working on film, the ghost like POV sequences, which are haunting and visually arresting and completely different in terms of the language of the rest of the film. Is that something where you have to take the time to really, do you do storyboard? Do you take the time to kind of fill out those scenes in particular? Because they do seem very dramatic overall compared to some of the other sort of moments within the film, because it's all very sort of nuanced and internal in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Those are definitely, I don't do storyboards necessarily. I do more just a shot list and overhead diagrams. That's what Norm and I work on together, but it's all in that. And also the locations, you know, even if it was just one shot, I really wanted to find the right locations for that. And, you know, so that was absolutely planned out, because I think those shots are definitely meant to be quite visually arresting, of course. So I wanted to make sure that we found just like really stunning locations and everything for that. And they took forever to set up too. Like those each shot, it took like an hour to set up. And then basically we'd be sort of, you know, it felt like it took 2 hours. Like it was a lot to set up those shots. So and once we got into the swing of shooting, we knew that and we knew to budget that amount of time. But at first I remember being like, oh my God, these are taking they take a while for sure. But yeah, they were something that we really talked about in terms of the overall cinematic language. And I think that we knew that there were going to be three distinct shooting styles in this. One is the handheld world of the children, where we feel swept up. It's a little bit more chaotic and subjective and intimate. And then the parents' world is more stagnant and removed and objective. And we really wanted to highlight just the, you know, the kind of isolation and staleness within their lives and relationship. And then there's the ghost cam, which was its own thing as well. And there was a lot of talk prior between Norm and I, just being like, are these all going to work together? But you know, we felt pretty confident by the time we got to shooting, and we decided to just, you know, go for it. And I think that in terms of lensing and stuff, we tried to find just, you know, a sense of unity there. And so yeah, I'm glad we just went for it, to be honest.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was
Yeah.
listening to you on the on Norm Wilner's podcast, and he was talking about how, you know, the 30s MGM musicals would have to stop and start, you know, based on the production number. This never does. It never feels like, okay, now we're entering almost into, you know, a genre horror-esque storyline. It feels all of one piece. It feels
Mm.
very fluid in terms of its stream of consciousness. And so when you're doing that, I think tone, I can't imagine how important that is to the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And tone is such an elusive thing because it's everything makes up tone, right? It's these silences of the actors in certain moments. It's the sound design, which was so beautifully done by Oscar Vargas. It's the cinematography and then how these all work together and the editing. And yeah, it's something that I think is a continuous thing to find and like and hone in on, because at any point in the process you can go a slightly different direction and it might feel off. So yeah, it definitely feels elusive sometimes as a director to just like pinpoint the exact tone that you want to create.
Absolutely. And I think, again, like you nail it in terms of the vulnerability of the characters, the isolation. You know, I know you've talked a lot about sort of, you know, not only racial identity, but in terms of just the idea of how a character feels in a family dynamic. And those things all play so beautifully together. I'm curious because, you know, this is your first feature film. Are you already thinking ahead to the next film and how maybe this movie might even affect, you know, going into the next one in terms of how people will perceive like, oh, what's next for you? Because it almost sometimes feels like your second film or your sophomore effort is judged even on a higher level sometimes than the
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, that's terrifying. But so true. Um, yeah, of course. I mean, I'm trying not to like worry about it, but just stay true to what I want to do and, just have faith that if I'm staying true to what I want to say, at least for a personal project that I'm writing and directing, like I hope that that will be that will just keep me on track and everything. Because it's one of those things, even with this first feature, it's easy to sort of think about and be like, oh, like what am I saying about what I want to make? Because this is like my first, bigger thing. So, but I also at the same time was trying to let that go and just say what I want to say instead of overthinking it. So yeah, for sure. I'm already writing my next project and I'm, you know, partially thinking about that, but also trying to just, you know, be very genuine in what I want to make and just keep trying to find what is interesting to me without overthinking that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is coming from a physical media collector point of view. Do you consider or have you looked into putting Seagrass on Blu-ray or DVD? Because this is an age where a lot of people are returning to physical media, but I also have noticed that a lot of Canadian productions, you know, from over the decades have not gotten the proper preservation, and it's almost impossible to find certain films unless Criterion releases it, or Canadian International Pictures, which seems to be taking on a lot of work recently in terms of 60s and 70s films. So is that something where you want to, make sure that there's a place for it, 10, 15 years down the line when people are studying your work as a filmmaker can go back and reference that?
Yeah, I honestly it's interesting because of course it's going to be on VOD in April and that's very very exciting and I'm just excited for more people to be able to see it. Um but yeah, it was actually last night I was just talking to my dad and he was asking the same question. He said, "Can I get a DVD or Blu-ray?" And I said, "Oh, well it's going to be on VOD." And he said, "I don't watch films on my computer." Like he doesn't really like to do that. He said he will if need be, but so yeah, it's definitely a good question and something that I'd love to think more about. But that maybe, yeah, I need to talk to the team about and see if we can do that. I'd love that.
Okay, just wait a second. Has your dad not seen the film yet?
Oh no, he's seen it three
Okay.
times. He's about to go a fourth time in a couple days.
Okay.
But he also wants a copy, like a physical copy.
So do I. And I think it's one of those things where, like, you think about it now, it's in the moment. Obviously, it's going to be available on VOD. It's going to be available for people to stream. But there is that quality of, getting a disc and watching the film. And sometimes, if you're lucky to get special features where you have a director's commentary, and it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to ruin sort of the intention of the film. I think, the movie speaks for itself, and your conversation today has been lovely. But, there is something that is really nice about sort of going back and looking at something and, realizing how special a film like this is and what it means to, I think, a lot of people, especially, children of divorce and people kind of going through that. So I thank you very much, not only for your time, but for this incredible film. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's so nice chatting about it, and thank you for the amazing questions on it.
Thank you. Thank you. I sometimes ramble, so I apologize
No,
if I was a
no,
little incoherent or what have you. But
not at all.
honestly, yeah, like this is one of those films where you watch it and you get so excited, because I honestly think like whatever you do next, it's going to be like, I just think like you're going to be like the next great filmmaker. And I don't mean to put
Oh,
that pressure on you, but like you're just seeing the shot choices and the direction and the intimacy and the vulnerability of the characters. It just feels like there's this great singular voice that has so much more to say. And it's always exciting to see the start of that.
oh, that is way too kind, but thank you so much. And yeah, it's been so lovely chatting with you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. I really, really do appreciate it.